So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Robert Padulo to run through and introduce us to his presentation here, and we're going to spend about half an hour running through how startup boards can support exits and how to maximize value. So Robert, hopefully you can unmute your mic there, and are you okay? But Robert's been 25 years as an entrepreneur, investor, very experienced, been through numerous exits, been through numerous technology cycles, and he's been a terrific addition to our exit team and senior advisor with us on our senior advisory network. So he's working with a number of companies right now and has been very active in together. So welcome, Robert. Great to have you. If you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself, then I'll let you take it away on the presentation, and I'll go ahead and advance the slides as you request.
Thank you, Nathan, and hello, everyone. Nathan, you could go to the first slide, please. We're going to cover three topics today. First, to maximize valuation, the board of directors must actively lead, even before the exit process. 2, board composition. Who should serve on a board of directors? 3, board size. 5 and later 6 are the ideal number. A fourth topic, compensating directors and advisory board members, is going to be left to be covered in the exit handbook. So what do I mean by the board must actively lead? If you haven't already done this, your board's next step should be to reach true unanimity on your exit goal. Often the reason that exits fail is the board of directors, especially institutional investors or the CEO having divergent and likely hidden agendas. These need to be uncovered and 100% resolved by replacing directors if necessary, so that alignment on the exit goal and other relevant expectations is achieved from the outset. Thereafter, regular, repeated attention on the overarching end goal will help keep directors, individually and as a group, focused on helping the CEO over, under, around, and through the hurdles to a stellar, truly agreed upon exit. Your exit goal can be as simple as, our exit goal is to sell the company in the first half of 2020 for around $150 million. We will engage an M&A advisor by Q1 2019. Every board meeting should start with a check for continued board alignment. Reread your exit goal together and ask if anyone has any questions, concerns, or ideas, or thinks the plan should be modified. Although there will be day-to-day, monthly, and quarterly priorities or fires that must take precedence in the short term over the eventual exit, the only way to achieve the long-term overarching exit goal is to constantly keep the end in mind. Work backwards from the exit goal to the present so that it informs all current decisions and actions. Regularly make sure that you're still on track to reach the end goal on time. A superior exit usually entails you actively selling your company to multiple buyers who view the opportunity as strategic to their business as opposed to merely additive revenue. That is, the bulk of the value they're paying for, what they're really buying, is strategic, not immediate financial value. So you will want a board of directors that can help identify the acquirers to which your company would be most valued as a strategic asset, because your company needs to understand potential buyers' challenges, mindsets, and strategic thinking, what they covet and why, and then shape your company to fit them like a glove. Irrespective of exit experience, the CEO alone should not lead the exit. Instead, before starting the process of selecting outside M&A advisors and investment bankers, the board of directors should form an exit committee. Most companies will be best served by a 3-person exit committee to work with M&A advisors and bankers and conduct the entire exit process, including all discussions with prospective buyers. Regardless of the extent to which the CEO participates on this committee, ultimate decision-making authority should rest first with the exit committee as a whole, then the full board. This small team approach has many advantages. An exit committee is more likely to maximally benefit shareholders and be perceived that way, avoiding management's inherent potential conflict of interest. At the end of the exit, the CEO and most, if not all, of the management team will become part of, i.e. work for, the acquiring company. They'll be at least somewhat reluctant to negotiate or argue too aggressively with the buyer, their future boss. So there needs to be a bad cop in the negotiations. An exit committee more easily enables multiple avenues to be simultaneously pursued in order to see which one plays out as maximizing exit value. As a team, an exit committee can more easily step back and reflect, evaluating the entire acquisition process to make sure all facets are being considered and weighted properly. And an exit committee will ideally include directors with industry expertise and M&A experience, multiple sets of expertise and perspectives, maintain checks and balances, yet still operate with agility. Last but not least, an exit committee lightens the weight on the CEO. Since the CEO will at some point become the limiting factor in the exit, offloading both tasks and decision-making responsibilities whenever possible to the rest of the exit team saves the CEO for those things that only the CEO can do. It frees up more of the CEO's time, attention, and energy to focus on running the business, keeping it humming on all cylinders and creating optimal strategic value, which is critical to realizing maximum exit value. It partly shields the CEO from the cumulative stress of the process to minimize the impact of CEO deal fatigue, which can literally incapacitate even the toughest CEOs at a time when it would be catastrophic for the CEO to crash and burn. As Basil Peters puts it, it's just not possible for any CEO and CFO to do the whole exit process themselves. It's almost impossible even with an outside professional M&A team helping them. Managing an exit is an entirely different business process that isn't staffed for and you can't properly staff for internally. The solution is to build a capable exit team. So what should the exit committee's relationship be with the CEO? Recall that the CEO and the directors all too frequently have different conceptions of an appropriate valuation. Compensation issues and the prospect of a change in employment position can affect the CEO's perspective and muddy a negotiation. Following the M&A advisors and bankers' guidance, the directors should help the CEO to understand what the market price is and accept that negotiations for the company transaction must take place prior to any discussions specific to the CEO and other company employees. The board needs to make it clear that any offer to discuss the sale of the company made to the CEO must be brought to the exit committee's or full board's immediate attention. There are times when CEOs mistakenly think an offer is too unfavorable and therefore board notification is not warranted. Unfortunately, there are many examples where such an offer was the only offer ever made. A couple of notes about the CEO. Despite the emphasis on the exit team, the CEO is not only very much involved, but may prove to be the team's MVP. As the most knowledgeable person about the business and its industry, the CEO's input is critical. Secondly, the CEO should continuously integrate whatever the exit team is learning and tailor the company accordingly to fit potential acquirers. The board's appearance to the outside world matters. In addition to the board's activities, the optics of the board's composition, which I'll cover in the next section, will also affect the valuation ascribed to the company. That is, even if only indirectly or subconsciously, a well-composed board makes acquirers think more highly of the company and consider it to be worth even more money versus a less outstanding board. Acquirers are impressed when they see that the board is well composed. It's a signal that the company is being overseen and run as a grown-up business, suggesting that whatever intrigued the potential buyer about the company is more likely to turn out to be true as due diligence proceeds. A weak set of directors, on the other hand, may raise skepticism about the company and reduce the potential acquirer's urgency or fear of missing out. To a lesser extent, much of the same can also be true of a well-developed scientific, technical, or business advisory board. Superb advisors and consultants can critically impact the long-term success of the company. So, Section 2, board composition. Who should serve on a board? First, the CEO. Second, representatives of investor classes who ensure the firm is focused on maximizing shareholder value and that money is well spent. Ideally, each shareholder class, common, Series A, etc., is represented. And if at all possible, these type 2 directors also qualify under categories 3A to 3E below. Type 3 is outside independents who are best in class in the areas in which you need support. People who add value through one or more of the following should comprise a required majority of the board per New York Stock Exchange guidelines. So 3A, functional expertise. At least one director should be an expert in finance. 3B, industry expertise. At least 2 directors should be industry experts with no conflict of interest. Note that this is quite different from someone with industry relationships and clout or influence. And this does not imply the need or even desirability of landing a big name for its own sake on your board of directors. The criteria for whether to add a big name should be the same as for any other director. The decision should entirely hinge on the value he or she would deliver. Because of potential conflicts of interest, a person with a big name or with connections that may be helpful to the company should not necessarily serve on the board of directors at all. Prospective acquirers may pass on a deal believing the director has a potential conflict, which big names frequently do. For this reason, big names are often better suited to serve as advisors, perhaps on the advisory board or as consultants. The latter's advantage is your flexibility to compensate him or her differently from other consultants or advisors. Fortunately, it's often easier to recruit big names to such a role than to the board of directors, which carries significantly more commitment, responsibility, and risk, especially legal and fiduciary, and requires a broader, not necessarily deeper, range of skills, knowledge, and experience. Experience with marketing or selling to the same market, preferably to the same buyers as you do. 3D, experience with solving many of the same business problems. And 3E, ability to think strategically about the company as a whole, its value proposition and its competitive positioning. That is, the specific business practices and sequence actions the company will execute to compete and win. In addition to a finance expert and 2 industry experts, there are 2 other generally valuable kinds of directors to consider. First, it's almost always helpful to have a still active or very recently active CEO of a business with multiple similarities or parallels relevant to your business. And second, during the exit process, it's extremely valuable to have 1 or more directors with M&A experience. Again, ideally in the same industry as your company. Ideally, each director will fill multiple value-adding roles. For each prospective director, consider, is he or she capable of helping to formulate a new direction if and when warranted? Will the prospect add intellectual and experiential diversity to the board, plugging weak spots and adding bench strength for guiding the central idea, strategy, and execution? Will he or she help the board become more effective, for example, by asking the right questions with conversational intelligence? And finally, will he or she make the time to be readily available as key advisors to the executives, active in the trenches and the inner circle, and help the CEO and board make better decisions? Directors should think of what they are doing both as a defender of shareholder value and as a leader of the company. Boards must evolve as early-stage companies mature. Select your directors deliberately, carefully, and strategically. The specific mix of value-adding characteristics, 3A to 3E that I just covered, that are needed on your board will depend on the company's situation at a given point in time. In what areas do you currently most need to add strength? The characteristics required on and from your board will be very different towards the end of the journey during the exit process than at earlier stages of the company. Just as the company's situation will change, so must its board of directors and advisors, i.e., the individual members serving on the board may need to change over time. This should not only be reassessed annually, but constantly kept in mind. Think like an NFL franchise, making not just annual, but even mid-season trades and personnel changes in order to field the best possible team at all times. Structures, reminders, and expectations to help effectuate board refreshment can be facilitated by both an active board governance committee focused on recruitment to ensure optimal board mix and term limits. For example, 1-year terms with elections each year, or instead, when possible, milestone-based term limits, such as until the next round of financing is concluded, or until the product is launched. The main causes of suboptimal or dysfunctional boards are, first, one or more directors act out of self-interest or ego and jealousy, financial or for the job of CEO, board chair, or committee chair. Or there's an overweight of type 2 investor reps and not enough type 3 expert directors. Or third, directors are not all in alignment with consistent goals. Effectiveness hinges on directors being both actively engaged and knowledgeable. That is, directors must keep current on the company's strategy and its industry, as well as their particular areas of expertise. Directors must also be outspoken. Of course, these three characteristics are necessary but not sufficient. So as a company, how can you ensure that you get everything you need from each director? First, you should screen for it in the recruiting and vetting process of directors, including by checking their references, just like when recruiting an employee. Second, clearly define your expectations of directors and have each sign agreement to it in writing. Third, onboard each director just as with an employee. Provide education on how to be a good board member. Your legal counsel should also educate and advise on the board's legal and fiduciary responsibilities. Fourth and finally, just as with an employee, as soon as you recognize that a director is not living up to expectations, the board chair should address the issue with the director and try to coach him up. But if that ultimately proves insufficient, the chair or governance committee must remove and replace him. The opportunity cost of that board seat is too great. That brings us to the board chair. An effective chair is crucial to an effective board. And chief among the chair's roles is that of governance and of the functioning of the board as a group. While one could write an entire book on this subject, exploring the chair's unique qualities and role, suffice it to say here, simply and emphatically, it should not be the CEO. For a host of reasons, the roles of CEO versus chair should be split and held by separate individuals. Section 3, board size. To gain a diverse set of perspectives and judgments, expertise, experience, and strategic thinking, and to achieve the goals described earlier. In the early stages, 5 directors are ideal. Later, say after multiple financing rounds, 6 may be better. Or, only if necessary, such as when type 2 investor directors insist on board representation, 7 may be needed or even indispensable. Note, the number of board observers, if any, should likewise be limited to try to keep the overall number of people around the table and involved in the discussion within this same range of 5 to 7 total directors plus observers. Or at the very least, observers' roles should be restricted to observing and listening with a restrained or minimal input. 4 directors or fewer are simply not enough minds to gain all of those necessary board characteristics, nor enough manpower to do all the work described earlier. You're missing out on the added value additional directors would provide. Incidentally, there's an ill-advised belief in having only 3 directors so that decisions can be made quickly. Usually this ends up being 2 type 1 directors, the founders, and 1 sole type 2 director, an investor representative. Besides lacking the brain power and manpower of a 5+ board, the other problem on a mere 3-person board is that the type 2 investor director's voice will tend to be dampened because the 2 insiders working together daily may be predisposed to certain decisions. When that happens, they control the agenda and information to be shared. And this leads to a fait accompli before the board meeting even begins. So, don't wait until some future financing round to add directors. That's a frequent mistake. Instead, remember, like NFL players, directors should not be treated as permanent fixtures. You should keep swapping members to optimize the mix of board characteristics while keeping the number of directors between 5 and 7. 8 or more directors are unwieldy. Too many people for this group to function optimally, stay agile, maintain effective relationships, individual accountability, etc. Must it be an odd number? No. An even number, 6, is actually okay. All other things being equal, the conventional wisdom is that you ought to have an odd number, either 5 or 7, to avoid tie votes. But these situations can be handled easily. A tie vote can be broken by the board chair, provided, of course, that this person is not also the CEO, remember, or other tiebreaker mechanisms in the board's bylaws. By the way, even if you have an odd total number of directors, there will be times when not all directors are present, or when the non-executive members of the board will meet to make decisions or vote on issues relating to the CEO, such as job performance, compensation, etc. On these occasions, the actual number of directors involved will be N-1. So regardless of your official total number of directors, in practice, you will sometimes operate with an even number and other times with an odd number. Anyway, a tie or narrowly split vote indicates too much disagreement and a decision needing more thought and work. So do you really need a tiebreaker after all? A tie is effectively a no vote and equals no action at this time, i.e. everything stays as is, but at any time in the future can be discussed further and readdressed. The decision on whether to have only 5 versus 6, or at most 7, directors should be based on whether you can find additional outstanding individuals whose characteristics would fill in any holes or strengthen your board further, whom you can convince to join your board of directors for the near and intermediate term. The fourth section, compensating directors and advisory board members, is covered in the exit handbook. So as soon as it's published, please go read that. What you'll find when you do is that relatively small investments assembling the strongest possible board, your leadership team, should ultimately produce a higher payout, maximizing your company's exit ROI. For more details, please read the chapter on startups boards in the exit handbook. And feel free to contact me directly. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Jay running through everything there and lots more detail in the exit handbook. So go ahead and open it up for questions here from anything we've covered today. So for those of you online, if you have a question, you can submit that into the chat window, or you can click on the Q&A audience module as well here and submit any questions that you may have there as well. So we'll try and pick up as many as we can here that we can answer. What do you think about that, Robert? And in my experience, I don't see CEOs actively managing their boards like an NFL roster. We need a little John Schneider training here for us here on, doing that kind of I think CEOs assessing their board, I mean, I don't see that happening very often. What's been your experience, Robert, on board turnover? And it sounds like there definitely needs to be an uptick in terms of the size and the tenor and the turning over board members. Doesn't seems like we're even close to what we could be doing there in terms of maximizing the potential. What have you kind of seen be the key kind of trigger to optimize that?
Yeah, and thank you for translating, because that comment or question was inaudible, and I was actually going to ask you if you could repeat it. So assuming that what you said was all I needed to hear, happy to respond. But if there was more, please repeat whatever else I should have heard. But yeah, so just to be clear, there's a fair amount of content that I provided that is best practice, but is not conventional wisdom and is not normally practiced. So what we're trying to do here is to tell people what they should be doing, not what they're normally doing. And the fact is that, and the reason I sort of emphasize that so much about the need to reshuffle the deck of to get the best players on the field for each game, for each season, each part of each season, is that most companies are not doing that. Instead, they're starting with too few board members to begin with. They're typically, either don't have a board or only have a couple of founders when we're first seeing them as angel investors. It then becomes like a 3-person board, and it tends to stay that way unless we insist on it. And then the next step is typically that the investors sort of appoint an investor rep, what I call the type 2 investor representative. And then that sort of becomes all that's done until everyone puts it off for another year or two until there's a new round of financing, when a new investor group may insist on putting on an investor rep themselves. And people sort of reluctantly add reps when they're forced to, instead of proactively seeing it as an opportunity to strengthen your bench, to add brain power and manpower who would actually help round out your team. And then finally, all too frequently, they're not rethinking about, is this person still actually useful given the stage we're at now? And would that seat be better filled by someone who has real expertise to fill a hole that we're now in? Because we're now in a new stage. We're no longer in product development. We're actually launching the business. Sadly, much of what I was covering now is not normally adopted, but it should be, and companies would be much more successful if they did.
Robert, we got a question online here as well about dealing with bad board members, with kind of bad actors that do have that, misguided perspective. For some reason, they feel like they need to try and take over the company, and can create a lot of. I think entrepreneurs hear some war stories about that happening, and it kind of scares them to death. And the few times I've seen companies go through it, it's never been a fun situation. So I think that does make them a little gun shy about expanding the board too much, because ultimately there may be a bad board member in there. So is there a way companies can and they can set themselves up to protect against directors coming in and causing more problems than helpful? Is there any way to kind of provide a process to not let it turn into a problem?
Yes, and thanks for raising that. It's one of the three most common reasons for dysfunctional boards and causing problems for the whole company. Like you said, it can kill a company. So sometimes they're bad actors because they're jealous of the CEO and they wish that they could take over, or jealous of the committee chair or the board chair. And so they actually have an ego and sort of are living through this company. I mentioned two other, common reasons for problems on the board. Another is that they're not all in alignment. I covered a few different steps that you should be taking with all board members beforehand. You should be vetting them. You should be checking their references. You should be interviewing them like you would a key executive to join your company. And then you should have them sign an agreement. They understand what's expected of them. So you should have a simple written document that says board expectations, and here's what we expect. And whenever you realize that someone's not working out for whatever reason, including if they're a bad actor, then fire them from the board. Or if you want to be, give them an opportunity to change, coach them, give them some feedback, say, here's how you're not living up to what we expect or what we need, and give them a chance to sort of change. Whenever you finally realize that it's not going to change, get rid of them. The sooner the better. Just as with a bad Apple employee, you'll never regret it. Now, in addition, I also talked about having term limits, which also help you being stuck with somebody. And if everyone's under the expectation that they could all be cut and traded at any time, like an NFL player, then that should actually motivate them to do better and work harder day in, day out throughout the season, so that next year when it comes time to elect board members, that you'll want to reelect them. But remember, shareholders have a vote, and they can vote someone off. That's still an additional protective mechanism. So there are a bunch of things you can do for this, and most of all, you should be vigilant and think about this. This is a serious potential problem, so put a lot more effort into picking the people in the first place, and then stay on top of it once they're on your board. But this should not make you gun-shy, just like bringing on executives and other key employees to your company should not make you the potential downside of hiring the wrong person. Either way, you want to get good people on your team. So the sooner you get good people on their team, the better.
Thanks, Robert. I think we could probably spend a whole other session just on this particular topic, but it'll be interesting to understand a little more detail about, bringing people on the board, off the board, and obviously doing shareholder votes every time, may not be practical, but having proxies in place or having some way of providing a little more efficiency in that process would be interesting to understand better, because I'm not sure many of us have seen that kind of situation actually execute itself in terms of what that would actually look like and how it would play out. So that's definitely something I think we can dive into a little deeper offline, and maybe even have an additional subsection just on that, and still maintaining that check and balance factor, but also making sure you have the best talent. So anyway, we got about 10 minutes left here. Let's. Anybody else have any questions in the room here? If you do have a question, please do speak up and speak right towards the mics so the folks online can hear you guys. So, Bill, do you have any questions?
I'd be curious to know, how do you recommend qualifying your M&A experts on the board? What specifically do you look for, aside from industry experience?
Robert, qualifying your M&A talent on your board, any particular qualifications that look for there?
So two different groups, right? One is outside advisors that exit committee will select to be the investment bankers or advisors for the company. The other category is, as I recommended, once you start going through the exit process, it would be especially valuable then, but at any time, even, early stages, it would still add value to have at least one board member who had M&A, exit experience in your industry, because that person adds perspective to the specific details that you're ultimately going to go through. So what was the question relating to that? Like more detail about how you choose that?
So it might be helpful, Robert, to develop a little bit of a scorecard that CEOs could use to kind of evaluate those potential candidates and kind of the range of characteristics and some kind of a scoring or handicapping mechanism. And again, obviously you're doing reference checks, background checks to validate that those things in the resume are actually real. Actually did help with those sale transactions, because we have seen things be a little overinflated in some characteristics. So just being able to check in on that. So I think that's a good feedback suggestion we'll note down.
Yeah, just a little plug. The Exit Handbook does have a chapter that I actually contributed on how to pick a good attorney. With the types of questions and everything that you should go through, because we do believe that that is a critical part of a successful exit, is making sure you have the best counsel for you. What if a board member that is the bad apple that you want to get rid of, if they're your access to funding or someone who helps you get funded? So the answer there is, that's tricky, right? And you have to weigh, the pros and cons of each person. But that person does not have to be on your board of directors. And this is something I go into in the Exit Handbook in more detail, which is you can rotate people. One of the challenges is, if you have term limits, or you're trying to shuffle the board, every 1 or 2 years or so. But what if you have Tom Brady on your team? You don't want to trade him, right? You want to keep the great ones. So there are a number of different things you can do to keep the good people, but still have the easy way to get someone else that you don't want off the board. And one of the things you can do is have the person move over to the advisory board. So if this person is going to help you with funding, they would still be compensated on the advisory board. They just wouldn't have a vote and be part of these director meetings where you're trying to be productive and make decisions in the best interest of the company. So I stick with, you got to get them off the board if they're a bad apple, but there are other things you can do to maintain a relationship and still get the benefits out of them, such as put them on the advisory board. There was another question I think someone misunderstood. Can management fire the board? Doesn't the board have power to fire the CEO? And the second part is, that's right. That's a key function of the board, is to decide whether the CEO is still the right person for the job or whether they need any coaching or additional help, etc. But it's not that management can get rid of a board member, it's shareholders can. And founders often have either a controlling interest or a very large share of equity in the company. And together as shareholders, we should be more active in voting bad people off the board if we were aware they were bad people or not doing their job. And so, once again, going back to Nathan's point earlier in the presentation, derives a lot from Basil Peters, we as shareholders, as angel investors, should be brought in and involved, engaged with the companies more than companies typically do. And it's not only up to us to be proactive to reach out, it's also up to the management team, to the founders and the CEOs of those companies to keep us informed by sending us newsletters, by sending out emails, by doing webinars, conference calls with us, and reaching out to specific individual investors for help or guidance, etc. Use us as a resource. And if we were made aware that, say, you're having trouble with a board member or something, then if we need to, we can have a special vote to vote that person off the board. Those were the couple of key questions.
Yeah, the delicate dance between maintaining the productivity but trying to avoid politics, always a delicate balance there. And but I think you just got to have the right mentality going in, set the expectation set with the investors as well. Here's what we're trying to achieve, here's how we're going to measure it, here's what we're going to do. And, frankly, it's going to be a little bit different than what we've seen as the status quo, so that'll be interesting to see as we have companies begin to implement that a little further and learn a little bit more about it. So that'll be interesting. So we're pretty much out of time here. We got a couple minutes left till 1:30, so if there are any other questions online. Oh, yeah, Bill, go ahead.
So if there's a fundamental question that my fellow board members at E8 ask ourselves is, how do we get the entrepreneur to pay attention to what we're asking them to do? We're minority owners, and we may see the wisdom in all of this, but no, they're going to be the Google of clean tech. No, they're not, but our voice is relatively quiet.
I think that gets back to kind of the coachability and a lot of those factors we look for as angels, is at least opening. Obviously, we do want some confidence there, but ideally through this kind of education, we'll be able to use a little carrot and stick in terms of, motivating them to get hopefully an exit sooner for more, which the wealth effect in terms of doing the use of proceeds in terms of actually, when you're going to sell your house, what do you want to see, right? You want to see how much money you're going to end up with after everybody else gets paid. And we think actually illustrating that to the entrepreneur may in fact be enlightening to them vis-a-vis taking lots of dilution and taking lots more time, and what the exit window would have to be to achieve the same result as an early exit. Oftentimes not raising those rounds of funding and exiting early is much, much more advantageous and less risky than taking much more capital, taking much longer. So it's somewhere in there. And just I think having that dialogue and having that ongoing, governance situation is something we're going to have to work on. So far, many of our CEOs have been very receptive to this and excited about it and wanting to get more support in this area, because these are marathon journeys. Each of the CEOs are running and their teams, and it's nothing worse than seeing them work that hard for that long and have it all turn into some bad situation that ends up without the result people want. So that motivational component can't be understated, and that cultural component is very important. So, Bill, thanks everybody for being here with us online. Hopefully the technology worked out okay there for everybody. We look forward to all your feedback. For everybody who joined us today, we'll get an email out with a recording of the presentation, as well as a copy of the handbook and the presentation deck.